Week 24, Overview, Kennedy's New Frontiers. This week's study centers on the election and first eventful year of President John F. Kennedy. Next week, we'll study the second 2 years of Kennedy's abbreviated term in which so many eventful things happened. Students at every learning level will continue to follow threads we began during the Eisenhower year: events in the space race, American culture and politics, particularly the civil rights movement, and foreign relations, which were conducted within the ongoing framework of the Cold War. It's amazing that so much could have happened in one brief 18-month period, but that's the way it was with the late 20th century. Life just seems to keep speeding up more and more as the decades unfold. The 1950s and 1960s were truly pivotal years in American history, and it's important to understand them in detail, which is why we're slowing the pace of history in our studies down during this unit. John F. Kennedy was a young, charismatic leader who won the election of 1960 by so small a margin that his opponent, Richard Nixon, could have called for a recount. Nixon didn't want the country to suffer, though, so he graciously conceded the race. After 8 years of mild-mannered and aging Eisenhower, the country was ready for Kennedy's campaign promises to bring them new frontiers. Kennedy gave a stirring and memorable inaugural address in which he called people to ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. His message challenged both Americans and the international community to give their best to the current problems that perplexed people around the globe. The address was also a stern warning that America would continue to oppose communist expansion wherever she could. Kennedy was not afraid to take on big challenges and wrestle them. He brought new ideas, energy, and initiatives to Washington, and he gave many people new hope. Your kids will read about his major policies, successes, and failures this week. For in daring great deeds, often fallible men make great mistakes. We'll cover both his successes and his failures this week, so let's get started. John F. Kennedy, JFK, was the son of Joseph and Rose Kennedy. JFK's parents were Irish Catholics from Massachusetts, a group that had been actively despised and oppressed by the Protestant majority in the 19th century. Joe Kennedy made millions of dollars, but he wanted more, and his wife, Rose, was eager for her sons to succeed. We're getting a little ahead of our story, but Rose got what she wanted, plus heartaches that no mother should know. 3 of her sons became U.S. senators, and more. John became president, but he was assassinated. Bobby became attorney general and ran for president, but he was assassinated too. Teddy ran for president as well, but he never got the nomination, in part because of his many personal troubles. The oldest of the Kennedy brothers, Joseph, never ran for office. He was a Navy flyer in World War II, and he died in a crash in 1944. John, his younger brother, Jack to his friends, was a Navy lieutenant, commander of a patrol torpedo boat in the Pacific. His little plywood boat was rammed by a Japanese destroyer in 1943, and he and his men had to swim for hours to the nearest island. JFK towed one of his badly burned crewmen to shore with a life jacket strap clenched in his teeth. JFK went on to further service in the war, but came home a hero, although his back, which had been a problem before the war, had been permanently injured, leaving him with chronic pain for the rest of his life. He ran for Congress in 1946 and won, and then won a Senate seat in 1952. Then, in 1960, he ran for president. The election of 1960 was extremely close. Kennedy was young, handsome, and Catholic. A lot of Americans still had a problem with that. Nixon had been Eisenhower's vice president, which would seem like a good platform for a run for the presidency, but it wasn't as easy as it looked. A turning point in the close race came when Kennedy outperformed Nixon during a series of televised debates. Nixon refused to wear makeup for the first debate, which meant that he looked haggard, with his beard stubble showing up prominently on the black and white TV. Beads of Nixon's sweat showed up on camera, making him look nervous. Kennedy, by contrast, looked like a movie star. He was self-confident and dynamic. To be fair, Kennedy did win some points during the debates on some substantive issues, but many believed that Americans were just ready for a change. While the public loved Eisenhower, by the end of the 1950s, many came to see his presidency as marked by inactivity and complacency. Nixon represented, or was at least associated with, the Eisenhower years. By contrast, JFK was an activist who spoke of a new frontier and pledged to make America the leader in the space and arms races. Kennedy also promised that he would make the United States a more socially just country. By this, he referred to the growing civil rights movement and the struggle in which many blacks were engaged for social justice. Your kids don't study this, but a lot of people also believe there was vote fraud in two key states: Illinois, home of the notorious Chicago political machine, and Texas, where JFK's vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, came from. Nixon had every right to call for a recount, but he didn't. Even though the evidence for fraud in Illinois was high, Nixon believed a recount might trigger a constitutional crisis. He would have to change the outcome in both Illinois and Texas to win, and he decided to spare America such turmoil. Here's another factor that made a difference in the election. JFK had a beautiful wife, Jacqueline Kennedy. Jackie seemed the epitome of culture and elegance. Jack and Jackie were wealthy, educated, beautiful people, as close to royalty as the White House had ever seen. No wonder journalists called the new Kennedy administration Camelot. The musical of that name hit Broadway in 1960, and it seemed to fit the Kennedy administration. There's something in the human heart that craves pageantry, glamour, and heroes who are larger than life. The adulation of movie stars and sports figures has sometimes filled this craving for Americans, but the Kennedy family in the 20th century, with their glamour, wealth, power, and tragedies, came as close to royalty as anyone in America at that time, much as the Vanderbilts, Morgans, and Carnegies had appeared to Americans in the late 1800s. JFK had plenty of challenges. One recurring theme was Cuba, that beautiful island that had come so close to becoming part of the United States after the Spanish-American War of 1898. Cuba had been an official U.S. protectorate until 1934 and was heavily influenced by America after that. The United States supported Cuban regimes that supported the U.S., whether they were good for Cubans or not. In 1959, a young revolutionary named Fidel Castro led an uprising against Cuban President Batista. At first, Castro seemed friendly toward the U.S., but the relationship soured after Castro seized American refineries and put some of his opponents in jail. Eisenhower broke off diplomatic relations with Cuba, and Castro turned to the Soviet Union. Cubans with property realized they might lose everything they owned, so tens of thousands fled the country. Many of these capitalist Cubans permanently settled in and around Miami. Eisenhower was worried about having communist forces within 90 miles of Florida. The Central Intelligence Agency came up with a plan to topple the new Castro regime. When JFK took office, he authorized that plan. The U.S. trained 1,500 Cuban refugees for an amphibious invasion. The plan assumed that once the refugees landed, other Cubans would rise up to overthrow Castro. The Bay of Pigs invasion didn't work out that way. When the planned uprising didn't happen, JFK had to decide whether to support the amphibious attack or let it fail. He didn't want a full-blown confrontation between U.S. forces and the Soviet-backed Cuban army, so he left the refugees on their own. The invasion was a military failure and an international embarrassment for both Kennedy and his country. JFK became president as the civil rights movement was really gaining momentum. The first significant civil rights situation of his presidency occurred when young people, both white and black, boarded buses that traveled throughout the South. These Freedom Riders were part of a campaign organized by the Congress of Racial Equality, with the acronym CORE. CORE wanted to see whether states would enforce a desegregation ruling that the Supreme Court had issued 15 years earlier. In a little-noticed 1946 case called Morgan v. Virginia, the court had ruled that it was unconstitutional to segregate interstate buses and the bus stations that served them. The case was little-noticed because the southern states just ignored it. Whites and blacks were still segregated in southern buses and bus stations. That changed when CORE recruited courageous riders to make the states comply with the Supreme Court ruling. Southern bus stations had never had to deal with groups of determined black passengers who demanded equal rights before. Freedom riding was legal, but it wasn't safe. A group of freedom riders in Anniston, Alabama was attacked by angry whites. The mob attacked their Greyhound bus and slashed its tires, which forced the bus to stop just a few miles out of town. About 50 carloads of racists followed it, and they firebombed the bus. The mob then held the doors shut as the bus burned. Something finally forced the mob to retreat. A rider with a revolver, some say, or an exploding gas tank. and the riders were able to escape the bus into the angry mob that beat them as they fled. They would have lynched them then and there but for a highway patrolman who finally stopped the violence. Another group was attacked by the KKK in Birmingham, Alabama. Despite, or rather because of, the violence, the Freedom Riders started to see their plan work as President Kennedy became actively involved. JFK ordered the governor of Alabama to protect the Freedom Riders. Soon after the attack in Birmingham, a few of the Freedom Riders who had decided to continue their venture left for Montgomery, Alabama. This group was also violently attacked. Martin Luther King Jr. arrived in Montgomery right after this attack. One evening, he and his hundreds of supporters were trapped inside a church by an angry white mob. The attack was so bad that King called Robert Kennedy, JFK's attorney general and little brother, to plead for aid. Kennedy ordered the National Guard out to restore order and assure the safety of King and the others. The Freedom Riders showed the whole world that there was a major racial problem within the United States. For the Kennedy administration, the ongoing campaign became another international embarrassment. The world came to see America's moral example as tarnished. By the 1st of November 1961, the Kennedy administration had responded to the events of the Freedom Rides by ordering the federal agency in charge of interstate travel to ensure that all bus and train terminals were actually desegregated, as the law required, or else be shut down. Between the botched invasion of the Bay of Pigs in Cuba and burning buses in Birmingham, the first year of the Kennedy administration was very busy. So busy that we're devoting 2 whole weeks to his one short term. Next week, we'll see how the rest of the Kennedy years played out.